Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing our series on Swami Kriyananda's 26 Keys to Greater Awareness. We are on number 19. And this one is, don't wait for others to love you. Love them, love everyone, not for what you receive outwardly in return, but for the sheer joy of offering yourself as a channel for this greatest gift of all gifts. Love is the natural quality of the feeling of the heart. Love becomes deadened, however, by selfishness. Unselfish love, once awakened, brings every cell in the body into harmony. It directs the energy of the brain powerfully toward whatever one sets one's mind to accomplish. Very interesting. He starts with love everyone, and he says, unselfish love directs the energy of the brain powerfully toward whatever one sets one's mind to accomplish. So he's actually really making unselfish love the secret of success, which is not exactly how people think about it. So let's sort of spend a little time and try to see if we can connect some of these dots. I myself was quite intrigued. Swami takes, 8 or 9 sentences and gives you a lifetime of study. I remarked once about his writing that it's like he's at the top of the mountains and he just walks across the peaks. And you have to sort of figure out how you got up there, everything that got you to each of those peaks. In this case, he goes from love everyone. It will powerfully direct your mind toward what you want to accomplish. All of us, most of us, struggle, with the ability to concentrate and to keep our willpower focused. And most of the lack of success that people have is just an inability to concentrate and inability to consistently and steadily push that focus forward. I have had an email conversation with an acquaintance through the internet, and it's one of those questions that I get every so often in my book. I'm looking over here, but I don't have. Yes, I do. I have my Ask Asha book here. There's a question in here. Now, it really is not going to do me any good, except I'm just going to advertise the book. I've been reading a blog by Scott Adams, who is the cartoonist who created Dilbert. He's a very interesting man. I'm not actually sure I would like him as a person, but he has a very interesting perspective. I don't like his cartoon because I think it's mean. But he has a very interesting perspective. But he's written a book, and he's very funny. Naturally, you would expect a cartoonist to be funny. And no matter what his subject is, at the end he always plugs his book. If you're interested in international trade, you won't find it mentioned in my book. He said, this blog has a lot of words, so does my book. He just makes complete non sequiturs so that he can always just keep telling you to go to your book. So this is actually my own curiosity, which I'm not going to be able to satisfy because I don't have my glasses on and I can't read. And for some reason, the designer thought that 8-point type was a good idea. I was looking at another of his book. You're a great designer. He's a beautiful designer, but he likes this tiny type. The whole point of it is that I answered in this book this question that I was asked on the internet. And the question is, isn't there an easier way? Aren't you holding back? Really, tell me. And so I've exchanged about 3 or 4 emails, and each one of them is just an end run around the idea that the only way you're going to get to there is from here, and the only way to get to there from here is step by step and day by day. And we're just always looking for some alternative to genuine, really hard work. That's the subconscious, superconscious tension that's always there. Subconscious mind says, what makes you really happy is when you put out very little energy and you can just sink back into relative unconsciousness. And what the superconscious says to us is, no, your energy is infinite and you must simply rise to that and overcome every obstacle that keeps you from doing it. And all of spiritual teaching, all of spiritual practice is just to retrain yourself through actual experience, which begins with willpower, to discover for yourself that in fact superconsciousness is far more gratifying than subconsciousness. One of the characteristics of Swami Kriyananda that I observed over so many years was that he had really overcome that delusion that even though I can discipline myself against that delusion, I can't say that I've overcome it by any means, by a long shot. Let me phrase it differently. Even though I can sometimes discipline myself against that delusion, it still attracts me. I still feel but just a certain subconscious pull, and wouldn't it be easier if we could just let go, stop making effort? I remember, to my everlasting embarrassment, but fortunately Swami Kriyananda was unconditional in his friendship. I remember sitting in front of him one day and I was quite distressed about something. Details are unimportant. And I actually said these words, but I said them with great emotion, perhaps even with tears. If life weren't so hard, it would be easier. At the moment, it seemed like something worth saying. So it was, he was completely expressionless. He didn't look outraged, he didn't look pleased, he didn't look displeased, he just remained absolutely neutral and just sort of let what I'd said just kind of float in the middle between us until it had just kind of fallen to the floor. If life weren't so difficult, it would be easier. Basically, it's the same question I was getting in the email. Can't you just tell me something that will make it possible for me not actually to have to do this step-by-step unraveling of my delusions, but I will just suddenly come to freedom? And the reason I'm looking in this book is that question was asked me, and I answered it quite effectively in that book. Just know there isn't. And as the more deeply we can integrate that single fact, the more powerful all spiritual life will become. If it's any comfort at all, as I was writing to my friend, the whole Bhagavad Gita that's the answer. It's like why Arjuna says to Krishna, even though men know where their happiness lies, seemingly against their will, they're constantly called back into the subconscious, although that's not the words Arjuna's using. So at least it's a really big question. It merits a whole scripture to answer it. Just a second now, I wanted to catch my thought here. What I wanted to talk about is, because I was saying, these are classic dilemmas. Even if the answer is obvious or simple, the dilemma that leads the mind to get so wrapped around it is classic. In other words, that's reassuring. And it's reassuring that this is the nature of the spiritual path. It's not like I'm having a weird problem here. This is what happens. And what I was thinking of was when Swami Kriyananda wrote The Festival of Light, which he did in 1986. He was in seclusion in Assisi, and he felt that a little bit of ritual would serve Ananda well. And so he felt inspired to write The Festival of Light. And when Swami writes, he doesn't plan things out mentally. He rather aligns himself with his consciousness on the vibration he wants to express, and that's his concentrated effort, is to align with the vibration, and then the words are essentially given to him. So in the Festival of Light, a third of the way into it, it says a fledgling bird. And Swamiji describes when he was writing it, and all of a sudden he was writing the words a fledgling bird. And he thought to himself, a fledgling bird? What does the bird have to do with anything? He said he was later, not in the moment because he was too serious in the moment, but later he remembered a P.G. Wodehouse story where this tough crime writer inherits a little cottage, like Honeysuckle Cottage, I think is what it was actually called, from his aunt. And the house comes with a certain stipend that he'll get every year, but the condition is in order to get the stipend, he has to live in the house. And his aunt was a writer of soupy romantic fiction, and she didn't approve of his tough guy detective stories. And this was her plot to reform him. So he goes to live in this cottage because it's such a sweet deal, but he's writing his detective stories, and just when the faceless corpse is having the hood taken off of it, and the hood, the crime syndicate is there watching, some sweet little woman comes sliding into the story, some, as he called it, some wee thing with her blue childlike eyes and so on. And he says these women, kept inserting themselves into the story against his will. It was like he called it the haunting of his aunt was haunting him. And finally, in the whole story, it's very funny. But eventually he has to flee from the cottage in order to preserve his integrity as a tough crime writer. So Swami's writing this very serious ritual, and all of a sudden a fledgling bird appears in it. But he said he had enough faith in his own intuition, he just followed. Now the reason I mention it is because every part of the festival is really beautiful. But the part about the fledgling bird, I find myself quoting from it more often than any other section. And here's the part that I'm wanting to say now. The fledgling bird represents the soul on its long journey from manifestation in the divine, being trapped by delusion, finding its way out of delusion, and finally finding its way home in 4 stages. First is the mission. The second stage is the revolt. And the revolt is when there is this reality to the way we're made. There is this reality to the divine harmony of which we are a part. You are a part of all that is. And we are a part. Let us celebrate our own greater reality. These are lines from the festival. Our being a part of a greater reality it is the dividing line, really, between the worldly and the spiritual person. The spiritual person understands that I am part of this greater in consciousness, greater in refinement, greater in spirituality than my present awareness. I'm part of that. I'm an extension of it, and my duty in life is to come back to it. But what happens to us is we begin to find pleasure in more contractive experiences, in self-indulgent experiences. And that's what happens to the little bird. He begins to enjoy the sort of puffed up feeling of power that he gets. And he mistakes that for fulfillment, and that leads us to a whole series of wrong choices. And it's called the revolt because we are rebelling against that which is, and imagining that merely because I want it to be true, it will be true. Swamiji so often talks about the beginning of wisdom is that you have to accept what is. You have to relate to what is. You have to see things as they actually are before you can transcend them or work with them effectively. So when you rebel, when you're in revolt against that which is, it will never succeed for you because you're trying to declare with the ego that which is true. We're just like little children. Little children, I want to have chocolate cake for breakfast. Mommy says, you won't grow up strong if you have chocolate cake for breakfast. The child says, yes, I will. Child knows nothing about nothing, but it wants the chocolate cake. And therefore reason follows feeling, as Yogananda said. So Mommy says, you won't go up strong. He says, yes, I will. God says to us, you can't endlessly indulge yourself in physical and emotional and psychological ways and just pay no attention to the greater reality and still find the happiness you seek. And we say, yes, I can. So we get to try it. And in the Festival of Light, it says about the little bird, that the little bird was told, be fruitful and multiply and share with others as we have shared with you, for you are a part of all that is. That's the mission given to the little bird, to expand your consciousness and share your expanded consciousness with all. But the little bird finds that it's better just to hoard and keep for myself. And so the bird says rhetorically, what else is wisdom, if not to keep what is mine for myself? Which allows us to quote scripture to selfish ends, which we do humorously whenever it suits us, to quote that line out of context completely, so it sounds like a justification. But that is what the ego thinks. But why should I think about others? Why should I be generous? It's appropriate that I take care of myself in this way, and if I think too much about you, then I won't be thinking about myself. What else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? So the little bird heads out in the wrong direction, and it says, the bird persisted in this revolt, even though repeatedly it lost everything it had. Oh, was that a poignant line? Even though repeatedly it lost everything it had. We don't give up our egoically inspired delusions all that easily. That's the conversation I was having on the email. Well, I know I should just be this way. How can I just be this way? Meaning divinely inspired and correct. Gee, step by step. Just long, arduous step by step. That's what the whole Gita is. Balancing all the different aspects, step by step, and continually resisting. So the little bird held to his false ideas, even though repeatedly he lost all he had, because we justify it in another way. We just are in revolt, and we're not going to look at the really dynamic, but dynamically challenging truth of the way we're made, which is that only through absolute unselfishness will we ever have the happiness we seek. And it runs against egoic experience as long as we're in revolt. What begins to change it, actually, is the great souls who come. And this is again the way the festival runs. We ask ourselves, all that I thought was light was but darkness. Who am I in reality? For what end was I made? That's the soul cry that goes up after many, many, many incarnations, where we keep trying to just make it work according to this first impulse we had, that if I can gratify myself, then I will be fulfilled, even though repeatedly I lose my friends, I lose my relationships, I lose my wealth. If nothing else, you lose it in death. And it can't come with you. You find yourself naked as you entered this world. Nothing can go with you. It's so obvious, but nonetheless so dramatic when you really get close to the edge of death. I don't even just mean personally, because I've never been there, but as I've said several times in this series, I recently had a month-long hospice experience with a dear friend, just going through the last month of her life while she let everything go. And as I said, you can say it, but when you just really watch, in this case, a woman friend of my own age, very strong, very attractive, until it was discovered that a cancer had been growing in her, and then 8 months later, her body was gone. But she was totally involved. She had clothes and possessions and a beautiful physical appearance and friends and activities and creativity and ambitions, just the whole list. And then piece by piece by piece by piece, it's all taken away. And not cruelly or by betrayal, but just in the natural course of the soul separating from its body, which was how we talked about it. She strove to get well for a long time. She tried to keep the body and the soul together, and then reached a point where it was obvious the soul was trying to separate from the body. And so when the soul is going to separate from the body, everything physical is lost. And because her dying process went on for some time, her husband, and with a little help from me, but only a little, we sorted through all the belongings, and by the time she left this world, everything else had also been let go of, which was very good for him, and I actually also think very good for her, even though she wasn't necessarily conscious on this plane of what we were doing. I think it helped her to pass free, more free, because it was just all that energy was released. Everything that she owned was dispersed to people who could use it or just cast away if it had no value. So there was no physical traces left. Repeatedly, we lose everything we have. It's so dramatic that all you have is your consciousness. And what is your consciousness comprised of? And so in the Festival of Light, all that I thought was light was but darkness. Who am I in reality? And for what end was I made? And then the festival says, ever and again, through your awakened sons, and yours, a capital God's awakened children, the answer comes. And what that means is the descent of the masters. That those souls who are farther advanced in this understanding, much farther advanced in this understanding, they are drawn back by compassion, and they move through the world of ordinary men and women, and they demonstrate the fruit of an entirely different way of being. Because after the revolt does not come realization. Immediately what comes is the quest for realization. So the third stage, there's the mission, there's the revolt against the mission, then there's the quest. For what end was I made? Then the awakened sons come and they give the answer. And it's either those souls of complete realization or those who have gone much farther down the questing path and then can turn back and describe to us what that path is like. And what magnetizes us to those great souls, above all, is their spirit of unselfish love. And joy, love is Swami said, love is the manifestation of inner joy. In that state of inner joy, one embraces and feels united with all things in creation. Swamiji has often talked that as so many centuries have passed, the reality of Jesus as he truly was gets confused by myth and misinterpretation, and individuals of lesser realization projecting upon him what they imagine he must be like. A friend of mine who had an advanced degree in theology from I think it was from Yale University, highly educated in a very intellectual way, once told me that the actual theological position of his church was that the entirety of Jesus' teaching was not actually revealed by Jesus, but gradually came to be understood over the next 300 years. I looked at him, I said, really, think about that. Jesus was a self-realized master with complete experience of infinity. And what came after it was intellectual men who gradually just lowered that teaching down to something that they could understand and explain. So they didn't actually reveal the fullness of it, they destroyed it and then felt more comfortable with it, and that's what they called it. And one of the traditions about Jesus was he was a man of sorrows, as Swami puts it. And Swamiji said no man of sorrows could have attracted the loyalty and the commitment and inspired in people the courage to leave everything behind. What people are drawn to always is joy. And the way that joy manifests out as unconditional love. I mean, think about it. What is it that really inspires you? And also, who is it that we ourselves want to be? All of life is this dynamic interplay between the desire to avoid suffering and the desire to experience happiness. When Master first came to America, just before he came to America, he wrote a little book. It was called then The Science of Religion. He didn't actually write it himself. He outlined the ideas, but he was not skilled enough, he felt, at the English language at that point. So he had one of his devotees write it, a Swami Dhirananda. Later, Swami Kriyananda felt that Dhirananda actually eventually betrayed Yogananda too, which did not make one entirely enthusiastic about him, but his attitude was much more intellectual. After he left Master, he went on to become a college professor. And Swamiji said, even though the ideas are there, the presentation was intellectual rather than heartfelt. But the science of religion was very simple, and it outlined just exactly that. Life is an attempt to escape suffering, and the corollary of that, an attempt to experience joy. It's fascinating if you reduce all your decisions, if you look at every decision you make, that's always what you're doing. No matter how complicated the reasoning or the situation, you choose that which you think will reduce suffering and or give you happiness. And so often it's so misguided and so ill-conceived, but that's what we imagine. That's what Krishna says to Arjuna when Arjuna says, why do we repeatedly do that which is not in our best interest? Krishna answers very simply, because Maya makes us think it is in our best interest. Otherwise we wouldn't do it. It seemed like a good idea at the time. That's my little mantra. Because no matter what I look at, no matter how misguided it turned out to be, it seemed like a good idea at the time, or else I wouldn't have done it. And that's how we learn, step by step. So now let me find the thought where I was with that again. Yes, but Swamiji felt that the ideas in that book were so important, he rewrote the book, and he called it God is for Everyone. He actually rewrote it as Master. He wanted to make Yogananda the author, but he was legally prohibited from doing that by SRF's attorneys. So he calls it by Swami Kriyananda. I don't think I have a copy here, so I can't pull it out. That's odd, I should. It's called God is for Everyone. It's a really marvelous book. Swami had an interest time, this is all just off to the side here. Swami had an interest time writing it because he really wrote it as if Master had given him the outline that he'd given to Dhirananda. So he wrote it without putting his experience into it, but writing it from Master's experience, which included making sure it was time appropriate, that nothing that was referred to was beyond the time frame in which Master had lived and written that book. It's a really beautiful story. God is for Everyone says, the way to escape suffering, the way to find happiness, is to unite our consciousness with the greater reality of which we are a part. We are apart from it, and that is, we are a part of that greater reality. That's the final answer. That's why God is for everyone, because this is what everyone is seeking, and God is the only answer for everyone. No matter, the problem is in the definition, not in the reality of it. So what Swamiji is describing, and in the Festival of Light, coming back to that, and about Jesus, is that there's just this radiating joy. And what you also see simultaneously from your awakened sons, as the festival calls them, is you see this capacity to transcend suffering. And it's very important to understand, once a soul incarnates in this world, and takes on the demands of a physical body and the ego structure that's required to operate a physical body, even if they stand a little bit outside of it. All the rules of this world apply to them. It's very, very subtle. In the Festival of Light, it says, speaking of the awakened sons, the full avatars, greater can no love be than this. From a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. Then the next line says, here then is the fourth and last stage of the soul's long journey. When we complete the quest, when we have our mission, when we rebel against it, when we then seek who am I in reality, for what end was I made, we finally reach the fourth stage, which is called the redemption, which means that all of our limitations are removed from us. We are redeemed from our limitations, and we become free in the spirit. And with that comes absolute selflessness, to the point where we embrace limitation, pain, and death purely for the sake of helping others. And when you see, and this is what Swamiji is pointing to in what he said here today, when you see that kind of absolute unselfishness, then with it comes this tremendous power. Swamiji said in another place that all failure is a lack of attunement. That was a very, I'm not sure that I can really wrap my consciousness completely around this. Sometimes I get a hint of what something means, but I can't quite find it. But Swami made that statement, all failure is a lack of attunement. And meaning that, but this is what Swami is talking about here when he says, unselfish love, once awakened, brings every cell in the body into harmony. And harmony would be the opposite of attunement. I mean, the opposite of being out of tune. Harmony and attunement. What is it? When you're attuned to something, you're aligned with it. You're in harmony with it. We talk about that. Of course, music is the most obvious example. If you're in harmony with the note that's being sung, you're attuned to the note that's being sung, your vibrations match it. So what Swami is saying, whenever we find ourselves, and failure is a sort of not a clear word to define, but when things don't go according to the way we set out for them to go, assuming our intention is a valid one, we have to just attune ourselves more carefully to what it is. There's this story, I think it's in The Path, where Master commissioned an artist to paint a portrait of his Param Guru, his Guru's Guru, which is Lahiri Mahashaya. But when the painting was presented, Yogananda didn't feel that the artist had really captured Lahiri's consciousness. And Master criticized the painting, and the artist was quite irate at having it criticized. And Master said, I think if I say this correctly, how long have you been painting? How long has it taken you to learn to paint? And he said 20 years. And Yogananda said, made a very disparaging remark. And the artist challenged Master and said, I'd like to see you do better in twice that time. And Master said, give me a week. And so Master describes how he had to get in tune with the skills of painting. And he had to work at it for a while. And each of his early attempts, it didn't quite capture what he wanted. But finally what he did was he got it in alignment with the capacity to create visually what you feel and see inside. And then he created a very beautiful painting. And when he invited the artist back to see it. He just had the painting on display and he wasn't anywhere around. And the artist, and this is probably why the whole experience took place, was humble and honest enough to say, "Who did that painting? It's much better than mine." And then Yogananda came out and said, "Well, as a matter of fact, it was I who did it." And of course, I'm sure that artist was drawn to Master for what he could learn. And to his credit, when he saw work that was better than his, he became interested in it rather than egoically rejecting it. You know, everything that happened with the Master was for a purpose. So what we're looking for always, if we're going to succeed, is that we need to understand how to align ourselves. And I'm sort of working from the bottom up in what Swami said. Unselfish love, once awakened, brings every cell in our bodies into harmony. Such an interesting way to put it. And then unselfish love directs the energy of the brain powerfully toward whatever one sets one's mind to accomplish. Because unselfish love puts us in tune. It puts us not just in tune with painting, it puts us in tune with everything. Because what is this universe in a very real sense except the unselfish love of God? One of the most the most transforming experiences of the spiritual path is the gradual awakening to this conscious divine force as unconditional love. It's really not something that can be cognized through words. All of us just long for that kind of being cherished, being accepted. We prize so deeply any relationship in which we feel that someone really sees us and then accepts us. They're nurturing beyond anything else. If one is fortunate enough to have that kind of a physical mother or a physical father who, him or herself, has the capacity to love like that, it's an invaluable blessing. Just to start out from the beginning is knowing that you're cherished in the right way, not indulged. That's really quite different. It's not true love that really indulges you, but true love that really stands with you in your own highest potential. And all the awakened sons open the doorway to that experience, partly through their own consciousness and their own relationship. I watched Swamiji over decades, and he had interactions with must be tens of thousands of people by the end of his life. He traveled all over the world. He met people in so many circumstances. He corresponded, he talked on the phone, and then when email came, he was always on his email. And many people, we found after his passing, and we knew also, but many people had very active correspondence with Swami, just long, frequent interchanges over the email that were just happening completely invisible to anyone except that one individual who was connected with him. And Swamiji always understood that whatever else he might have to offer someone in terms of guidance or wisdom or advice, it was all secondary to the experience of unconditional love. Because if you know that you're loved, even just by one person, and the way Swami loved us, it was so impersonal. It's a paradox. It was impersonal because Swamiji's own consciousness was so attuned to the unconditional love of God that when he looked at individuals, well, that was a question that was asked him. A man came to visit and had been there just a few days, and he said to Swamiji, he said, I feel more love from you than I've ever felt in my life, than I feel even from my own family. And he said, I've only known you a few days. And he just said to Swami, how is that possible? And Swami's answer was, he said, I don't know you like your family knows you. You know, your family knows all of your experiences and your personality and all of these different things. Swami said, I don't know you on that level. He said, but when I look at you, I see within you the presence of God, whom I already love. And so what I'm loving in you is the presence of God. And what that was also saying is, that's really who we are. Because this personality, I was speaking of my friend dying, it just goes away. She'd been a very attractive woman, and she remained actually absolutely beautiful to the end. But all of her salient characteristics went away. You know, the body shrank. Eventually her ability to speak went away. Her hair was gone from the chemotherapy she took. She became, even gender was hard to perceive because the body was so reduced to its absolute irreducible minimum before it gave up the spirit altogether. But the less there was of the distinctive features, the more powerfully there was of this infinite spirit of which we are all a part. And so the effect of Swamiji loving us with that impersonal divine within you is that we ourselves became more conscious of that as our own reality. You know, who am I in reality? For what end was I made? Ever and again through your awakened sons the answer comes. And Swami was an awakened son, and he brought the answer. And he explained it to us absolutely brilliantly in more than 150 books or something like that, and thousands of hours of lectures and private conversations and emails and letters, everything, so many different ways. But it was really the experience of his consciousness, which is still absolutely present. And it's really the experience of his consciousness even that you receive through his books. And when you're in the experience of that consciousness, you come into attunement. You're receiving that unselfish love, but it's also awakening us to our own potential for that. It's really quite a, well, it takes your breath away. An awe-inspiring understanding of how very, very simple it all becomes. Recently I had to give a class on a fundamental aspect of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Just basically the 8 limbs and then the yamas and the niyamas. And I picked up the book, which actually happens to be this one, the Raja Yoga book. This Raja Yoga book is now in book form what used to be a series of lessons. I first started reading those lessons in 1969. He revised them in 1971, but I read them continuously in that form for decades. So when I pick up this book to read it, I mean, like I know this book. But somehow, when I read it for that particular class, there was Swami's consciousness. Well, let me phrase it differently. I was able to attune myself to his consciousness. Read exactly the same words, but it was the experience. It was the exchange of magnetism, and I just came out of it, came to it from a completely different perspective. Just FYI, it's an audio tape, so it would be on anandapaloalto.org recently, 2016. I'm not really quite sure how to find it, but I think you can. So what Swami is demonstrating, and coming back to this concept of unselfish love, is he's demonstrating what the accomplished fact looks like. And what that does for us is it inspires us to try. If you have any, well, it goes two ways. When you watch the power in him, the power of that unselfish love, the power to produce happiness and to escape pain. Because Swamiji accepted limitation, pain, and death, he did not ride above it. He lived in it. And many, many, many very challenging things happened to him through his lifetime, as happened to Yogananda, as happened to Jesus Christ, as happened to Krishna, as happened to St. Francis, as happened to Teresa of Avila. Any awakened son has to live through and has to demonstrate for us. That's their point. It's for the salvation of mankind. They demonstrate for us. So I watched Swami over all those years constantly responding to every challenge with unselfish love. And I watched it from two sides. I watched what it did for others, what it did for me, and also what it did for Swami. Just how he could just cut through so much suffering that I was trapped in, because I was always asking the question, let's see, the sheer joy of offering yourself. Love everyone not for what you receive outwardly in return, but for the sheer joy of offering yourself as a channel for this greatest of all gifts. So I watched Swamiji and being attacked often quite viciously. You know, it's a strange thing in this world. I read it somewhere. I'm not sure whether it was Swami or Master who said it or was in someone else, but it was a very interesting statement. It talked about wherever a planet is in the cycle of the yugas. It might have even been in Purushottama's book about the yugas, I'm not sure now. Wherever we are in the cycle of the yugas, the darkest age, Kali Yuga, the age of energy, Dwapar, that's where we are right now. We've come out of the darkest age, we're in the second age of 4, so we're moving up, but we're not that high yet. Every age is defined essentially by the balance point of light and darkness. And in a very advanced age, the entire planet, it collectively becomes much lighter. And consciousness of the whole globe is just higher. When Jesus was crucified, crucifixion was a common punishment, public crucifixion. You go down the road and you'd see people dying on crosses next to you. I mean, such barbarism is unthinkable nowadays. But still, we're just coming out of electrocuting people and giving them lethal injections. We do it in private, and we're beginning to feel it's not such a good idea. But you can see that the refinement of the planet has improved. But we're still going to war and doing all kinds of other things. But depending on the yuga, the balance of light and dark is maintained in a certain way. It's not even. I don't know exactly where we are right now. I think dark still predominates, but light is growing. But what that means is there can only be so much light, and the darkness is going to fight against it. And bear in mind, Earth is not an end in itself. It's a planet that we pass through in a physical incarnation for what the circumstances of it will teach us. It's for our quest. We're questing. And we incarnate on a planet that has the right balance of light and dark for whatever it is that we're trying to learn. And so planet Earth for us right now is just that right balance. So Swami Kriyananda, a being of enormous light, comes onto this earth, and because of that light, dark keeps trying to snuff some of it out, to hold the balance of light and dark. So he was betrayed and attacked and sued and testified against and accused and loved and lauded and awarded and adored. It's just, this is this planet. It's both things. But in all circumstances, Swami would bring to the fore this unselfish love. And what unselfish means is simply, it's not about me. It's not about how you're treating me. It's not whether you've been nice to me and have deserved what I'm going to, I'm going to love you because you've been so loving toward me. It's that it's my nature to love. As Swamiji said when he was vilified through his entire life by his own Guru Bhais, early on in his spiritual life, they, I started to say excommunicated, they essentially excommunicated him, except it wasn't Catholic, and maintained that till the end. But he said, if I become angry with them and cease to love them, as he put it, he said, I've lost twice. I've already lost their goodwill and their company and their friendship. He said, but if I now close my heart